Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for joining us for this session. For the next 60 minutes, we'll be focusing on how do we create the enabling environment in Africa against the backdrop of China slowdown, currencies falling, commodity price depression, and consumer spending halt. I think there's another seed to add, which is corruption in Africa, for those that want to know about it. So for the next 30 minutes or 60 minutes, we'll have a robust panel discussion about this topic. And to my left, Chinelo, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Chinelo Anohu-Amazu, the Director General of the Nigerian National Pensions Commission.
Scott?
I'm Scott Mackin. I run the power investing, international power, particularly for Denham Capital, who's a specialty energy-focused private equity firm, and we're developing power projects around the world, but Africa is a big part of that for us.
My name is Gachao Kiuna. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of TransCentury, which is an Africa-focused infrastructure company. We're listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. We operate now in 12 countries across Africa, predominantly focused on power and transportation infrastructure.
Abele?
My name is Abele Okobi. I work for Facebook, where I head public policy for Africa.
My name is Ali Mufuruki. I am based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, investing across different sectors in various African countries.
Okay, before I start asking the panelists any questions, how many of you are investors in the room? And how many of you would like to invest in Africa? Okay, interesting. So panelists, we've got to convince the people in the room about why Africa is a great place to invest in. So let me kick off with the first question. What do you think is the number one challenge in Africa, and what needs to be done about it? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll jump in and talk my own book for a second, if you'll bear with me. So, as Ali was saying actually before in our meeting session, without power, it's very, very difficult to have a middle class. And without a middle class, you're not going to have all the consumer-driven growth that you need. You're not going to be buying from other countries. You're not going to be selling to other countries. You need electricity. The general statistics for Africa are, Sub-Saharan Africa has about the same amount of power generation as Spain, 47 million people versus well over 800 in Sub-Saharan Africa. If you pull South Africa out of that, it's about the same power generation as Norway. So amazing amount of under-electrification that has to happen. And you can go beyond that into water provision and other infrastructure, but for us, power is absolutely critical for hospitals, for schools, for education, for manufacturing, and you name it. So in terms of what has to be done about it, there's two Africas. There's an Africa represented by Kenya, Morocco, South Africa now with its renewable program, where it's really gotten its act together, and they run highly competitive procurements where they can attract international audiences and bring amazingly low cost of capital. And then there's a lot of the rest of Africa where essentially presidents have, they're banking a lot on their re-election by getting power over the end line. And so what they're going to do is give a lot of people rope and see who can actually pull themselves up to victory. And it's a real blocking and tackling development game. There's not many people in that market who are capitalized to take projects from that concept stage all the way through to operations. And that's what we're trying to step in and fill. We won't necessarily be there at the very beginning of a project, although sometimes for renewables we will be. But generally what's happened is a junior developer will have stepped in and they've got thoughts, concepts, maybe they've done land rights, maybe they have a power purchase agreement or things like that, but it requires somebody who has skills on the ground that can take that project all the way through, and then the capital to actually take you through to operations. There is an amazing amount of capital available for any plant that's operating. So we just executed sale of our first 3 renewable projects in South Africa without running an auction to a US listed company, and did exceptionally well doing that. One example, there's tons of other examples. But even as you get into financial close and you've now just shed yourself of development risk and you've brought everything to bear that you want, there's an amazing amount of capital for that. And we find right now we're developing through one of our portfolio companies nominally about 2,000 megawatts of power with GE in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And the people want to come in now. They're even willing to take development risk just to get a seat at the table for financial close. So the problem is that there's that gap to get the deals done. And that's where we're stepping in and trying to fill that gap. And it's a blocking and tackling thing. We've done it elsewhere around the world. And it certainly can and will happen in Africa. And we won't be the first ones. We won't be the last. But we think it's an area where there'll be tremendous growth for a period of time. And an opportunity to do well by doing good, because you're lowering the cost of power in these places. And you're making your profits, hopefully, by creating something of value.
Great.
I agree. I agree with I think that power is both a challenge and an opportunity. I just want to add two more to the list. One, I think one of the barriers is really related to ignorance. And when I say ignorance, I mean ignorance about the continent. Our colleague said that there are 2 Africas. I would argue that there are actually 54. I mean, Africa is not a country. It's a continent filled with different countries who are at completely different levels of development and completely different levels of risk. And I've often been amazed at how people talk about Africa as if it's a monolith, and also without recognizing that different countries have different profiles. And I think that there's a huge opportunity there to educate investors and to educate people about the differential levels of risk. I just got back. Got back from Kinshasa, and how many of you have heard of the DRC? And so when you think of the DRC, what do you think of the DRC? Those of you who haven't been, what are the images that come to mind? Right. And so I found it interesting, and I'm someone who I've worked across Africa. I'm supposed to cover actually 47 countries of Sub-Saharan Africa, and I hadn't been to Kinshasa yet. And even though I know that the danger of a single story, and that often the stories that you hear about countries in Africa are not necessarily don't necessarily match the reality. But even I was shocked to fly into Kinshasa, into a brand new airport, on incredibly beautiful roads, to stay in a luxury hotel. And I'm not saying that that's the reality everywhere across the DRC, but just the fact that that exists, I know that that's something that a lot of times people don't necessarily think of. So I think that ignorance about the continent is a huge barrier to investment, and it would be amazing if I would say, but if more platforms, if more news media reported the actuality of what's going on across different countries. Of course, since I work for Facebook, I will say another barrier is really related also to connectivity. Obviously, I think connectivity relies very much on power, but the extent to which economies now move on information, the extent to which economies move on technology, I mean that the extent to which countries across Africa are not connected, to that extent they fall behind. And when I say technology, I don't mean just as consumers of technology. Often when we talk about technology and access, we talk about things like, oh, look, people have a mobile phone and they can access Facebook, or they can access WhatsApp or Twitter. That's not what I mean. I mean the type of connectivity that allows people to be creators, not just consumers. So that to me is a barrier. I think an opportunity there is really around connectivity, really around thinking of innovative ways to connect people to technology and to create, again, as I said, creators and not consumers.
Ali, I watched your TED talk recently, and the doctor recommended antidepressants for me. I know you talked a lot about infrastructure, lack of trade barriers, agriculture, education, poor environment. Africans were destroying their environment, and I know infrastructure was passionate to you. Could you just elaborate a bit more on what Scott has said about the infrastructure deficit in Africa?
I mean, as an obstacle to investment, I think Scott has said it very well. I don't think I can add more to that. But maybe to explain something that you probably already know, that Africa is not well understood by most people who take an interest in it because of the limited sources of information on the continent, relevant market information on the continent, and the depth of it. Before the 2008 global financial crisis, there was hardly any bank in the West that had one or even two analysts constantly watching market developments in Africa. It was completely off the radar screen of everybody. It's only after 2008 that people started looking at the possibility of, digging for data, looking at what's happening in African markets and what the opportunities were. And yet, most investors, or majority of investors, look for this information from these same sources, from Bloomberg, from UBS, from HSBC, those confidential investor reports that you get from your very highly valued analysts. They are very shallow when I read them in terms of their understanding of what's happening on the continent. Why? Because Africa is looked at through the European or American or Asian lens by people who have never visited, or if they did, never really took an interest to understand what the markets are like, what it will take to grow businesses there. If I could give you an example, I have a lot of respect for companies like Coca-Cola. In my city, Dar es Salaam, which is a city of 5 million people, maybe half an hour's drive from where I live, Coca-Cola sells a Coke bottle of half the size that it sells elsewhere in the city. Because they did research and understood the people in that part of the city, which is about 2 million population, but mostly very poor. They love Coca-Cola. They want to have that same quality Coke that everybody else drinks in the luxury hotels on the peninsula. But they cannot afford the big 350 or 330 milliliter bottle. So they gave them the bottle of 175 milliliter at half the price. I think Coca-Cola respects customers wherever they find them. If you look at their marketing campaigns around Christmas, whenever there is some kind of celebration, they roll out big marketing campaigns. What they advertise in New York is what they advertise in Africa. Yeah. It's what they advertise in some remote place in South America. They have massive respect and understanding and empathy for their customers. And I think that if you want to do business in Africa, you have to start with that. The mobile phone companies benefited maybe from that accidental respect that they had to develop for African markets, because they came with a business model that was designed for Europe and realized trying to sign up a customer in Africa, ask them for their home address and their bank account and their salary. These are highly mobile people who don't have a salary, don't know the name of the street they live on, and they're not going to be there tomorrow, okay? Because they are highly mobile. They realized this is not going to work, and asking them to deposit $3,000 for an expensive phone and to have a bank guarantee for their monthly bill, they had to go back and re-engineer this business model, and that's how you got the pay-as-you-go concept. That revolutionized communication in Africa. And it was actually a product made for Africa after they discovered this model doesn't work. So when you come to do business in Africa, come with an open mind.
Can I stop you there and hold that thought for a minute? I guess it's like the HSBC advert. It says act local, think global, act local. So now, one of the things I strongly believe in is that in order to move Africa forward, we've got foreign investors coming in, but local investors and Africans need to help themselves. And just back to your point on electricity, Chinelo, what are your thoughts on what the pension funds are doing in Africa, especially in Nigeria, for example, where we've got a severe infrastructure deficit? The pension funds can only invest in government bonds or equity or real estate. Why aren't they investing in infrastructure at the moment in Africa, or in Nigeria particularly?
Well, thanks very much for that question. And I'd like to align with what my colleagues have said earlier. I think it's all about perception. At the start of the pension revolution in Nigeria, it was something that was considered impossible by many. This was about a decade or so ago. And from a deficit of 2 trillion naira to what we have now as pension fund assets of about 5 trillion, that's about $27 billion. This is a clear case of having to solve your own problems by yourselves. And this is what we are advocating in creating an enabling environment for Africa, is Africans actually taking the lead. Because, like you said, that local impact is understood more by Africans than anybody else. I think it was you, Gachao, at the World Pension Summit we had last week. It's one thing to evaluate a risk you have never seen happen. It's one thing to evaluate a risk you have never been part of. Everything will be extended beyond belief just so you cover the investors you're supposed to be addressing. Africa in itself, and now in particular countries, have to get into their particular mindset to be able to address the infrastructure deficit. This is the story in building sustainable pension systems in Africa, and we're actually moving from an opaque, ill-governed system of defined benefits to pay-as-you-go, whereby you create a contributory pension system shared by both the employer and the employee, and it's managed by a clear-cut private sector financial arm, regulated by regulators such as PENCOM, and then every fund that you gather goes into an individual retirement savings account. What that has shown Nigeria, for instance, over the past decade is the ability to gather domestic funding. And that funding is the next step where we are at. How does it go into infrastructure? There's a whole gamut of allowances for the pension funds in Nigeria. The problem in not going into infrastructure is lack of investable instruments. It is the structuring of the instruments that these funds will go into. The pension funds, by their long-term nature, and this was a hot topic at the Pension Summit, because every country who's trying to reform their system has seen the potential to gather in this $5 trillion, $27 billion we're talking about, less than 7 million RSA accounts, and we have about 32 million to go of the known working population. So the key thing is, how do we structure investment vehicles that will be able to solve this infrastructure deficit, as well as meet the liability, the primary mandate of the pension reform, which is to pay retirement benefits as and when due. That talk has started, and several things have been put on the table, some of which is getting co-investors. When they said how many were investors, I saw a lot of hands being raised. When people who are not from the country are trying to invest, they feel more comfortable when there's skin in the game. And the pension funds have suddenly emerged as that skin in the game, because wherever you find the pension funds going is clearly based on the track record of how they have structured their investment regulations. Some say too stringent, but we say at this point just right. Okay. And these are the things we are talking about, and we've even involved the federal government, because in some issues, most of the investors have a problem, and most of that problem is centered around fear of policy somersault. In Nigeria, for instance, the pension reform has shown a clear departure from that, where under our fourth president, and both have shown the same political will for the reform.
Thanks, Chinelo. Sorry, can I just bring in Gachao on that? So, Chinelo, you talked about lack of investable instruments, but this is not Einstein theory. All over the world, they're investing in infrastructure bonds, and mostly in Kenya, for example, they've got a corporate bond market. Gachao, could you just tell us about the genesis of TransCentury? How a number of middle-class Kenyans got together, started an investment company, quoted and listed it, and now have a corporate bond on the Kenyan bond market.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just pick up on this point about domestic capital and a little bit about your first question about the challenges. But if I take a TransCentury perspective, which I think is an interesting example, TransCentury started with 24 million shillings, which is $250,000 worth of capital in 2004, so just over 10 years ago. And essentially, we invested that in one small company which had revenue of $3 million and a net income of $100,000. We've since grown that company, turns over now about $50 million, has a net income of last year about $7 million, and since that have grown with a balance sheet now of about $200 million, and recently also had a Eurobond out in the market for $75 million. But the $250,000 is really the only equity that's ever gone into the company, so it's been a tremendous return, as you can imagine. Now, what's driven that return? If you look, and if you just take Kenya, where we are from as an example, from Kenya's independence in the mid-60s to 2004, we were only able to connect 500,000 households to power. So only 500,000 households, say an average of 6 people per household, 3 million Kenyans had access to power, okay? If you look last year alone, there were 1 million households connected, right? So double the households were connected in 1 year than had been connected in 40 years of Kenya's independence, okay? So, you know, we do talk a lot about, you know, the infrastructure deficit, but it's not like nothing is happening. There is, you know, a huge revolution happening. It's just that, obviously, in power, it's not like telecom. We don't have the disruptive technology. So, you know, you have to physically build out the cables, the transformers, and, you know, and the lines, et cetera. But there has been, you know, a huge, you know, transformation that's continued to happen. But despite these big numbers, there's still a huge underpenetration. So in Kenya today, I would say we're probably at about 26% of the population who are electrified. But then obviously if we keep going, then that's going to have a big difference. Now, a lot of this is to do with government policy and just people being able to focus on some of the issues. I think people are, the money side of it is actually a lot less so much of an issue. Because if you look, for example, and you know, people love to compare South Africa, but if you put South Africa aside and you say, let's compare Kenya and Ghana, you know, Ghana has twice the amount of people electrified as Kenya, okay? And, you know, it's hard to explain that, right? You can't say that Ghana has any more money or any more, you know, resource. It's just that at some period of time, they really had a big focus on actually electrification, you know, and the government there, you know, focused on it, right? So, you know, it is possible, you know, to do that. You know, you can't really explain why Kenya would have, you know, half the penetration, you know, as a country like Ghana. And this sort of brings me to an interesting point, which is, and it really struck me when we did some work in a previous life when I was working for McKinsey for the Kenya government. And the president had this aspiration where he said, look, Kenya needs to become a middle-income country within the next 25 years, which was his target. And obviously, when you do the maths, to really get there, you know, you need to grow at a very high growth rate. It's about 10%. So, you know, his view was that if we grow at 5%, it's not enough. We're not really going to get there. So, you know, we need to double up our efforts and aim, you know, for more like 10%. And so the question really was, you know, how do you really get to, you know, 10% growth, you know, year on year over a sustained 25-year period? Obviously, being at McKinsey is very analytical, so, you know, we looked at everything. Everybody has their own hypothesis and theory. Lots of people talking about should we be democratic, non-democratic, and all kinds of issues to do with development. But the only single thing that really is common between any country in the world that has achieved this, and by the way, there are only 7 countries in the world who've been able to grow at 10% over 25 years. Now we're talking about, you know, the Chinas of the world. There's only one thing you can find in common, or we were able to find in common between them, and that is the level of investment over GDP must be a minimum of 20%, okay? If you look at China at its height, investment over GDP was 40%, okay? Or, you know, it's maybe even higher, it depends which numbers you want to believe, but certainly it was very high, okay? But you can clearly see the minute it drops below 20% investment over GDP, you never get to those high growth rates, okay? Now, obviously, you can have it the other way around, where you get to above 20, but you don't achieve the growth rate, which means you have the investment, but you've wasted it, but you never have it the other way around, where you miraculously achieve this growth without the investment over GDP. And the really interesting insight, actually, that came out of that was that if you actually look at where the investment came from, for all the countries without exception, over the 25-year period, obviously at different times it changed, but the majority of the capital came from domestic direct investment, okay? So DDI. And I think this is where, as Africa, we really get it wrong. You know, we have this belief that this great Chinese investor is going to come and build all the infrastructure, or this great American investor is going to come and build all the power, right?
Maybe not.
Obviously, it's complementary, and we need both. But if we don't develop the domestic capital markets, if we don't develop the pension funds like Chinelo has talked about, the insurance market, the financial system, if we don't develop our own capacity in terms of actually building infrastructure, et cetera, then it's not going to work. And I think maybe that sort of ties in nicely with your question around the problem. The one thing that strikes me today is that if you look at most African countries, almost all of them, more than 50% of GDP is sitting in agriculture. So agriculture and wholesale and retail trade. So that whole agriculture, food, consumption space is more than half the GDP of these countries, right? So, to get to, high growth levels and to really drive GDP, jobs, and exports, for me, it becomes impossible to see how you can do it without actually having, a big impact on agriculture. And I think this is, one of the things that, is a big gap, right? Africa has a big opportunity in agriculture, but we're really not doing anything about it. It's where most of our people are employed. It's where most of our people, derive an income. It's what affects inflation, macroeconomic stability, everything. Yet we continue to do it hugely inefficiently, without sort of exploiting that. So I think that we need to get just the basics right, develop the domestic capital markets, develop our basic industries and sectors, which is not going to be a secret. It's going to be agriculture, it's going to be manufacturing, it's going to be infrastructure, just the basics. And the great thing about it is that, in Africa is the only place where you make outsized returns for doing very simple things, in the rest of the world, nobody gets compensated 20% equity IRR to build a power plant, right?
Great.
But
Gachao,
in Africa,
okay.
it's possible.
Thanks a lot, Gachao. We need to move on in the interest of time. So please, panelists, could you make your response very brief, and then we can move on and get through more things. One of the things that's always been said about Africa, as you rightly said, was that people tend to look for landmines instead of looking for golden nuggets in Africa. So where are the opportunities? I mean, we've got a host of investors in the room. Where would you say the opportunities lie? Can I come back to you? Because Facebook is in Africa and it's not there for philanthropy. What is it there for?
I mean, I think that there are many opportunities. But in the interest of being brief, I will talk about, I think that there's huge opportunities around technological innovation. I think we've only scratched the surface in terms of what's possible. But in order for that, I mean, in the same way in the US, in order for that to explode, we need capital. I mean, so if you think about all of your tech entrepreneurs, many of them had to fail. And the environment across most of the continent is that a lot of your brightest people go into careers where they think that failure is something that won't happen. It's very difficult to be a tech entrepreneur in the context of Nigeria, or it's very difficult to be a tech entrepreneur. Your parents will say, wait a minute, what? You're not going to be a doctor? You're not going to be a lawyer? You're going to just start a tech business that may fail? And so I think there's tons of opportunity there for people to invest in technological innovation. By that, I don't mean like a silly app to feed your dog. I mean, real
Sorry,
tech.
but what specifically is Facebook doing?
So what we're doing, we're doing two things. One, we're betting really big on access. So we think before you get to the point where you can innovate in terms of technology, you need to ensure that more people have access. If you look at the percentage of across the continent of access, I think it's like 19.6, and in a year it only grew 1.6%. And you compare it to other parts of the world, it is punishingly slow. And so for us, we see a huge opportunity and a need to invest in access. So we're doing that. I don't know if there is an announcement that we're partnering with Eutelsat around satellites to provide backhaul. So we're going to work with operators to essentially to make sure that technology and technical access is available in rural communities where the majority of, or many Africans live. And the second thing is really around, we have within the company a team that focuses specifically on developers, and so we've just hired developers to focus on Africa. So those are two steps.
Ali, you wear multiple hats in business.
Yep.
Which business would you put all your money on?
All the money. Look, two things. Africa is full of new consumers. Everybody's excited about that. Everybody wants to get all these new consumers, the so-called new middle class that's emerging. We are producing tens of millions of that on the continent every year. But there is a problem. But maybe let me speak about the opportunities that in the ICT space, and I'm happy that we are actually partnering, like one of my companies is partnering with Facebook right now we are building a pilot in central Tanzania that is going to provide high-quality internet to rural populations at very, very low prices because of this technology that we have. and the launch of that pilot is going to be, of that test is going to be next month. So that is very exciting. We are looking at bringing millions of people online. They can do video calls from villages. That is high-speed internet that's not even available in cities today. So we think that is going to be a real game changer. We're doing the same project in India. The Modi government has a goal of bringing 650,000 villages, giving them high-speed internet. We are involved in that project, the same technology. So that is an area that seems to attract quite a lot of interest, including my own, because of what's happening today. The problem, however, though...
No, don't talk about the problem.
No, I have to say that. I have to say that because on the one hand, you have this opportunity, but the opportunity is tricky, that Africa is full of poor consumers. Poor consumers. There are many in number.
But that's an opportunity.
There are many in number, but poor. So when people tell you that they have middle income because they make $1,000 a year, that's not rich. That's not going to make me rich. You know what I mean?
But you're contradicting yourself because in the beginning you talked about Coca-Cola making a product
I know, but I want Africans to be comparable to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
We don't want to just be rich in Africa for Africa.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We want to be comparable to the rest of the world. That's we need to up our game. We need to increase the opportunities for our people to make money, to become wealthier, even as we create these possibilities.
I do agree with you, but as an investor, these investors, they're not looking for 1 times money, they're looking for 10, 15 times the money. How do you get a unicorn from what you guys are developing?
That has an incredibly high return, that particular area. Agribusiness.
$1 billion valuation in what you guys are talking about in tech sector in Africa.
I think right now you're talking about basics, and I think this is to your point.
No, but we've got to move forward from basics.
Yeah, but you have to get basics before you can move forward, and I think a huge part of it is investment in capital. I mean, you don't get a unicorn unless you have people who are willing to invest in talent.
I'll give you an example of what we've invested in, an online retailer called Mall for Africa. At the moment, it started 2 years ago, it makes $1 million every month. And, we need to talk about real commercial opportunities rather than social ventures across Africa, because if we continue talking about social ventures, none of these people in the room will want to invest in Africa. Can I have any question from anyone in the room? Please.
I want to disagree.
Yeah, please.
With that you just said.
Yeah, I agree.
I think the opportunity is about things that are social.
Are you an investor?
Yeah, we're creating a private sector development.
You're creating.
And the issue really is access to capital as well as access to the internet. And I think where the big opportunities will be is getting the cost of capital down and capital flowing a great deal more into the early stage entrepreneurs who need that capital with a risk that isn't bet the farm risk, that can be done on a portfolio basis. So the question is, how important is it to crack the access to capital? Huge. And to do it with joined up thinking that
Chinelo, that's a great question for you, access to capital.
Well, I think I'd rather not be pigeonholed into what we consider the place to go. An investor goes to where they hope to make money. Just a minute.
We're in the room full of investors.
No, that's the point I'm making exactly. And that investor appetite should be wide where Africa
Why
is
should it be wide?
Where Africa is concerned. And the reason is the simple sheer numbers. He asked the question, access to capital. And the key thing is structure in whatever format. He's just talked about technology. She's talked about access. I'll talk about real estate. I'll talk about agriculture. There's just so much to do. The key thing is the structuring so that there'll be an easy inflow of capital. And that is why you see a lot of private equity firms going into Africa and coming out successful, because they start other companies, go and invest them, and leave them a better place than they are, corporate governance-wise. You do not invest in Africa seeking where you're going to get the highest returns. The sheer numbers in Africa that allows you to almost excel and make returns in every field.
Yeah.
I'll take, for instance, real estate.
Lovely.
The pension funds
Yeah.
have recently had reforms allowing those who hold contributors to use a portion of their retirement savings balance to purchase their primary homes. There are no houses. 18 million housing deficit.
Yeah.
Which investor would not see that as an opportunity?
Well, investors don't like real estate in Africa.
Scott,
Scott, could you come in there first?
Well, I want to agree with a lot, but I disagree with. I do think you can seek high returns in Africa if you're going with fundamentals, right? Because there's so much growth potential in Africa. So it's not anything other than you should make money by adding value, and you have so much room across so many sectors to add value. But you can't be in and out as an investor. You have to dig deep. You have to view that. And look at again. I'm private equity. We're not hedge funds. We're not in and out in a year or two. We generally have 5-7-year business plans. But you can make good money doing that. But you're only making good money if you solve issues. I do want to give you one statistic because a lot of investors here may be shocked. But okay, in our world of power, which is pretty big around the world. Moody's did a study, and I'm sorry you're hearing this again. Moody's did a study of power project defaults around the world for 30 years. They do it every year, they issue it. So you have all this investors, and we're predominantly at this point US, although we're expanding our investor base beyond that. And people think, well, I've got to invest in US power, right? That's safe. If you look at the amount of defaults in US power over that 30-year period, 9.6, 9.7%. What's that? What is it in Africa? 15, 20? Try 2.2. So there's a perception of risk that really is quite extraordinary and isn't supported by the facts, because you have great involvement of multinationals. You're fundamentally serving a need as opposed to giving people something they don't need any more of in the US or Europe. And so that's how you make money. But it is a blocking and tackling business, a step at a time. And so, gotcha.
So another show of hands? Yes, please.
Capital. I was going to touch on microfinancing, but I think we've discussed a lot about access to capital. I guess my comment, and I'd love your insight on this, is, we've discussed from a consumer and a corporate level the access to capital. I think we need to consider also at a central bank and almost a ministry level, and the requirement for capital access and funding at that level, because really you are seeing in developing, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, with the macroeconomic backdrop, the oil prices, the devaluation of currencies, etc. Central banks need access to funding now more so than ever. I just wonder if you could comment on sort of how you view things at that level and how the impact of a very stable central bank level can be then filtered down to more sustainable growth.
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, please. I think this is the Achilles heel of most African countries because, and I want to be maybe a bit ruthless about it, governments in Africa lack discipline, okay? And if you look at it across the board, they're spending way too much money on recurrent expenditure and not enough on development, okay? And it doesn't matter where the oil price is, whether it's up or down, they always find a way to put it in because the politics of the countries is such that you basically spread the goodies amongst the different communities, etc., right? And there's just no shortage of people who you need to find jobs and favors and all the rest. And if you look at China, which is and I don't want to belabor that point, but the reality is China is saving is putting 50% of its money into development, into capex, right? And they've been doing that consistently for a long time, And 50 years ago they also didn't have the money, but they drove the discipline to actually save and whatever. So, and I want to leave this as really the key point is that our biggest problem in Africa is that we have governments who don't save, and then because of that, they mop a lot of liquidity out of the market, and then that makes it very difficult to now really start to have domestic capital formation and really get the economies to move. So it's a fundamental problem.
Sorry, the lights are, yeah, please, the lights are so bright I can hardly, yeah, please.
My name is Samuel Omugu. We help governments in Africa, spread across their bankable projects, bring in the right
Sorry, can we have the question?
The question is, all the time when I fly into Africa, it breaks my heart and I cry most time in the hotel room. My question to you is, what do you think would be the best way to solve the power issue in Africa?
Scott?
Well, as I said before, you have some countries like Kenya, Morocco, South Africa who are able to run procurements. That's not true in a lot of places. And so those governments, however, generally speaking, and I understand there's 54 different countries and we're not in every one, so we've picked the ones that are generally open for business where they really want to see people who can get over the end line. And I don't want to sound like too much of a graybeard, but I've been doing this for a long time in a lot of different countries around the world. And you can pick the countries that are willing to transact and live up with their agreements. I lived through the Asia financial crisis in the Philippines, and everybody did well and prospered, versus those that don't. And it does, but it really requires people who are willing to fund yourself all the way through that gap, because that is the biggest value accretion you can get. As I mentioned before, and you would agree across, a lot of money will come in at financial close. You have tons of people who want to come in and buy operating power projects. It's that funding gap with knowledgeable people on the ground, and we've got a great, two great teams in Africa, one for large power stations and one for renewables, that we're willing to fund the G&A for them. We're willing to fund their development. We're willing to take binary risk. What we want back from governments is that they're going to be commercial. So we want to know that they've got an international law firm on their side, and international banking arrangements on their side, that they're willing to look at precedent, because we're not the first guys in the block who've done this. There's other projects in Africa where you can look at the precedent, you can say, do you want Bujagali? Do you want Takoradi? What do you want? Let's look at these deals, and we can negotiate from those deals. Let's be commercial, and you want to get it done, and not have what was quite often in my past. India may have changed. But it's saying that we've lived without power for hundreds of years. We can live with for another 3 or 4 more. We all know, those who have done work in Africa know all sad stories of people who've died because of access to power.
Great.
So you got to get going.
Another question? No show of hands? Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, let's take the country which I know best, which is Kenya. Okay, Kenya today has $30 billion sitting in our pension fund system. Okay, this is all the pension fund managers who've collected money from Kenyans who earn a salary and pay Provident Fund normally contributions. Okay. Now I'm talking about the local old mutuals of the world, National Social Security Fund, those types of people, okay? So they have 30 billion. So it's very small. There's a lot of people in this room who themselves manage more than 30 billion, but so the entire market is 30 billion. But it's not zero, okay? Now, if you talk about a power plant, the types of power plants that we're building are not costing 30 billion, right? We're talking power plants of 100, 200, 300 million, right? So the capital is available to build these assets and for that capital to go towards long term. The challenge becomes when the government comes into the market and borrows and takes all of the money to basically spend on recurring government expenditure, right? So all those pension funds, they then don't, it's a very easy choice. Either I lend money to government, which in Kenya I can do today at 20%, 22% the last week, or I take the money and start to come and do a power project. Of course, I'll never do the power project, right? So the issue then becomes, unless government really has the discipline to live off the taxes that it collects and really make sure that it's not coming into the market to mop up that liquidity, then you'll never have the incentive to make sure that those savings actually then get applied and go actually to where they should be going, which is to funding some of the long-term assets.
Yeah, but this leads to two problems, right? So either you change the regulation framework, because pension funds are extremely limited as to what they can do, right? Therefore, government needs to intervene there. Or government starts issuing bonds to actually build upon those bonds.
Hence my question to Chinelo at the beginning. We've covered it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's actually the second option. Really, would be what it is because pension funds are already, like Gachao said, it's not that the environment isn't there. The regulatory framework allows them to invest in power, but is it financially viable for them? Is it not easier to invest in government bonds? And typically, because of the safety of the government bonds, that has the highest allocation in any pension fund asset. In Nigeria, for instance, we have a high level of 80% of assets under management in government funds, and currently the level is 63%. And the PFAs go there because it's safe and they make their returns anyway.
But
I think the key thing...
Isn't that where lies the problem? Why is the government bond market crowding out the market for available
It isn't
finance?
crowding out, it's a choice. At each point in time, nobody puts a gun to your head to put it into government bonds. You choose to, as a PFA, because it's safer. So the question Mamadi talked about is what actually we're advocating with the governments now. Raise those bonds, but channel them towards more infrastructural development. So the PFA still invest in government bonds, but then the utilization of that government bonds becomes something channeled towards development.
Yeah, great. Sorry, good.
I think we're getting terribly sidetracked here. The question that Mamadou is asking, which I think is extremely important, how do you save money you don't have?
Yeah.
And this perception of the African consumer as being ready to consume and join the world consuming community and become a sustainable market is an illusion. It's not yet there. Now, I hope I'm not at the wrong meeting. I thought that here we are going to exchange ideas and experiences, and out of this will come some recommendations to African governments of what needs to be done.
And that's the final question.
What needs to be done to improve the investment environment on our continent.
Yeah.
Not that I'm going to be dishing out advice on what you should go and do, where you can make money.
Yeah.
You all know how to make money in Africa. Anybody can make money. I've met real people who said they made a killing in Angola when it was at war, okay? They made lots of money in DRC Congo when it was fighting. Sometimes even this so-called investment environment doesn't require peace. Sometimes it's much richer to do business at war. So what I'm trying to say is this. It's very important. I mean, you get excited about the 27 billion that Nigeria has in its pension funds, or 30 billion in Kenya. Compare that to South Africa. South Africa is a small economy compared to Nigeria today.
Great.
Do you know what they have in the public workers' pension funds alone? It's close to $100 billion. Just the pension of the public workers. Do you know how much money they have in California in the pension funds? So I'm saying that what I'm trying to tell you is that we should not get too caught up in this few $1 billion that we've gathered over so many years by working a tiny part of our population that has jobs when the rest of the population is so dependent. We have people who are consuming and consuming, not producing. Yeah. The only way you're going to have a sustainable market in Africa is when you provide the one thing that every country that has developed has: electricity, power. You asked, why is money not going there? I think that's what we need to crack, because everybody who wants to invest long-term in Africa is interested in making sure. Facebook must be interested in making sure that consumers in Africa have electricity, not just to switch on a light, not just to charge a phone, but they must have electricity to produce, to power industries in Africa, to revolutionize the agriculture. That's the only way we're going to have a sustainable market. Because I live in Africa, I'm not interested in my ability to make money. I make money easily. That's not a problem. It's very easy. You make money in Africa all the time. That is not the issue. The issue is that, is this a sustainable place to make money? Is this a sustainable place to live? It certainly isn't. So you cannot, when you have 20 million young people joining the workforce every year, a workforce, a labor market that produces less than 500,000 jobs a year. This is the Africa that is real today. This Africa that in a few years' time is going to be impossible to live in, to do any business in. So again, you cannot create millions of jobs if you have no power. So what we need to tell African governments is the critical importance of powering their economies of electricity. So it should not just be enough to build roads because that makes people happy. We should prioritize construction of power plants, even higher than roads right now, so that all the money that we have, all the money we can get, and the reason why people are not putting money into power plants in Africa is because most of them are controlled by governments. They're extremely corrupt and bureaucratic. You have only one client who has to buy power from you and doesn't pay. I know of an investor who actually came to see me who's producing power in Tanzania, is owed more than $100 million in unpaid bills by our utility, and they have nowhere to go. If they switch off power, they're actually being forced almost at gunpoint to switch it on again because you want to make us look bad, especially now during election time. So it's very difficult. People are not going to put money there. But I think that our politicians have not fully understood the critical importance of this particular sector. They think that you can develop by giving handouts to people. You can develop by promoting tourism and by promoting telecommunications. These sectors are okay. We make money in those sectors. But Africa is not going to become sustainable and wealthy in a manner that other countries have become if we don't do some kind of serious investment in this particular space. So that should be, in my opinion, a recommendation that should go.
These are powerful.
That's powerful.
I'll take it, he agrees.
I think you're in support of one at the moment.
There's a question there.
But in all seriousness, I think Milken Institute has identified this issue, and yesterday we spent 6 hours in a roundtable of some of the largest investors around the world talking about how to crack this power problem in Africa. And the bottom line came with the pension funds in Africa, that they need to step up to the plate. And we're talking about credit enhancements and financial innovation. Plus the fact that the old type of power where you have a unitary power system doesn't work any longer. You've got to have distributable power plants, captive power, self-generated power. And I think in some countries in Africa, they're going down that way. But it's a long road. And just coming back to you, Scott, you talked about you've been on the road for quite some time trying to raise funds. And if you read the Wall Street Journal today, there was a comment by, I can't remember his name now, he said that there's too much money going into Africa, that there'll soon be a bubble in private equity. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I don't know about, we're not an Africa-specific fund. We're a power-specific fund where you're looking to apply the same recipe in economies that need low-cost power. So we're big in Latin America, we're big in Southeast Asia, we're big in Africa as well. I think that there's, what I see from the investor space is an increasing interest in what I'll call high-end infrastructure getting into private equity, knowing that if you're just going to be pure infrastructure, you're kind of a commodity. Your money is kind of a commodity because it's very difficult. You're waiting around for someone to bring something to you, and then you're going to be auctioned off against other people. So they've had to move up that chain and move up that chain. And so we've had tremendous interest there. We have not seen anybody say anything like that. Most of what we've seen with some of the U.S. investors is, I love this idea, you got to go pitch my board because I'm afraid of Africa, which to me is crazy. I did business we were talking about this yesterday, I did business in places like New Jersey and Florida where I ended up testifying against government officials and putting them into jail. It's never happened to me in Africa. So it's this consistent misperception, but they're open to it. They're open to get over it. So I don't see that.
So one part of the equation is investments, and the other side is the fiscal side on taxation. Ebele, where does Facebook stand on taxation?
Where does... I don't understand the question.
The easy question.
Facebook stance on tax is that we pay tax wherever we are assessed.
That's a very good question.
Can I make a comment on taxation?
That's very good. That's very good. That's a very good question. Okay, we're soon out of time. So if there's one recommendation that you give the investors in the room, what would it be? Gachao.
Keep away from government and embrace technology. That's how to make money in Africa.
Right. Scott?
Look for edge and sustainable edge and how you're doing it. If you are just looking for deals to come your way, beware.
Chinelo?
Forget the hype. The opportunities are real, and the sooner you go for it, the better. It won't be around for much longer.
Fantastic.
I would say educate yourself. I mean, there is a world of opportunity, but it doesn't come to people who are not educated.
Ali?
In spite of everything I've said, there's no better place to be today.
Now you have the room.
Well, I do agree with you. Just to give you a bit of background, Helios I work for Helios, it's an investment fund. We raised $3 billion in capital so far, and we've been deploying it quite conveniently in Africa. And we've got our investment banker there who, in a couple of weeks' time, will be listing a power company, an infrastructure for us company in Africa, in London. So Africa is not all gloomy. I think there are great opportunities, and any investor that wants to know more about Africa should spend time with the panel. Thank you very much.